Before we start, a quick note about what this channel is and what it isn't. This isn't a recap channel, and it's not a highlight reel. We're here for the parts of Panem that happen after the cameras turn away, the systems behind the games, the contracts hidden inside victory, the lives that keep unfolding long after the anthem ends. Each video on this channel is built to slow things down, to follow the logic the Capitol relies on, the details it hopes you won't connect, and the people who live with the consequences year after year. If that's the kind of Hunger Games analysis you're looking for, you're in the right place. Subscribing just means you'll keep a seat here when we move on to the next story. Now, let's start where Panem always wants you to stop paying attention. You remember the fence line in District 12? Katniss and Gale, bows slung, slipping under the wire to hunt in the woods. It feels like the safest place in the story. No cameras, no Capitol. Just two kids sharing bread and dark jokes about the games. But here's the real question. Was that actually the most dangerous place all along? At face value, Gale is the opposite of a threat. He's the one who teaches Katniss snares, who shares his kills so both families eat, who swears that if her name's drawn, he'll keep Prim alive. The story frames that relationship as a promise. This is the boy you can trust when the Capitol takes everything else. So why, by the end of Mockingjay, is he the one Katniss can't even look at without seeing fire and shrapnel? We're used to asking, is Gale a villain? Did he go too far? Is he responsible for Prim? But that question is almost too small. The deeper puzzle is this. Was Gale always written as Katniss's dark mirror, the version of her that never pulls back? And did we just miss it on the first read? You think back to those early scenes in the woods. Katniss is focused on survival. How many squirrels? How much bread? How to keep her name out of the reaping bowl. Gale is already talking about blowing up the Capitol, already fantasizing about tearing the whole system down. There is a lot to uncover here, because that's not just teenage anger, that's a strategic mindset pointed at total war before the games even start. So how do we get from loyal hunting partner to the mind that helps design the double explosion trap at the nut? The same logic that makes him a good provider in District 12, efficiency, no wasted motion, no wasted shots, turns into a ruthless calculus when he's working in Beety's lab. That part matters because the narrative later mirrors that exact design in the parachute bombing that kills Prim and the Capitol children. On the surface, the trilogy gives you two Gales. One is self-sacrificing, anti-Capitol, the boy who's whipped in the square for defending a woman in his district. The other is the soldier who shrugs that in war, you kill or you die, and is willing to target peacekeepers' families if it means breaking the enemy's will. How do those two versions coexist without collapsing into a straight-up villain or a pure tragic hero? This is where we talk about authorial intent. Suzanne Collins never steps on stage to call Gale evil, but she does something more interesting. She positions him right on the edge of the moral line Katniss refuses to cross. The games turn Katniss into a symbol. They turn Gale into a weapon. So in this video, we're going to cover whether that edge was always there. If you trace him from his first joke about blowing up the Capitol in the woods to his last off-page promotion in the Capitol's new military structure, do you see a good person broken by war, or a carefully seeded almost villain the story has been warning you about from the fence line on? And if he was always the real long-term threat, what does that say about hope, about rebellion, and about who actually wins the games. Why Gale's arc changes everything about the Hunger Games. If Gale is the real long-term threat, then suddenly the love triangle stops being about romance and starts being about ideology. This is where we talk about why his trajectory quietly rewires the entire series in your head. Think about how you probably met Gale on your first read. He's the rugged hunter on the hill, the one who hates the games out loud when everyone else in District 12 just tries to survive them. At face value, he's the rebellious alternative to Peeta's soft-spoken Baker energy. Early fandom treated him as the real match for Katniss. Same background, same anger, same refusal to play nice with the Capitol. So why does that same character end up associated with the bomb that kills Prim? Why does the story move him closer and closer to President Coin's tactics until Katniss can't even say goodbye? Here's the real question. Why does Suzanne Collins give Katniss a best friend who talks like a revolutionary from Chapter 1, then have his ideas echo the Capitol's worst war crimes by Book 3? Why seed that we could blow up the Capitol line in the woods, then pay it off with double explosion traps at the nut and a near-identical strategy in the Capitol Square? There is a lot to uncover here, because that part matters not just for his relationship with Katniss, but for how the series defines moral responsibility in war. Gale's arc is not just about which boy she chooses. Reducing it to shipping is almost a defense mechanism, because the alternative is harsher. You're watching how war reshapes a good, hungry, furious teenager into someone who can rationalize mass casualties as necessary. When he and BT design weapons that maximize secondary deaths, the text isn't winking at a clever strategist. It's quietly asking you, when does righteous anger curdle? When does a victim start using the Capitol's playbook while still believing he's the hero? And the stakes of how we answer that are huge. If Gale was always meant to slide toward villain-adjacent territory, then the trilogy becomes a warning about a specific kind of resistance, the kind that turns people into instruments. The kind coin represents where victors and children are just pieces on a board, but if he wasn't, if the intent was simply tragic but understandable ally, then maybe the films and fandom twisted him, sharpening every harsh line until he reads as the designated wrong choice. Either way, Gale turns victory itself into a question mark, winning, overthrowing Snow, even shooting Coin that doesn't end the games. The moral games keep going in Victor's village, in District 13's war rooms, in the quiet of Katniss's kitchen when she thinks about Prim and can't separate her from Gale's designs. He becomes one of the clearest test cases for the series' biggest problem. How do you fight a system built on dehumanization without becoming another version of it? So what happens when we go back to the beginning and track Gale with that lens from his first scene in the woods? Our thesis: Gale as Katniss's dark mirror, not cartoon villain. So if we track Gale from that first scene in the woods, what are we actually looking for? Not proof that he was secretly President Snow 2.0, but something much more uncomfortable. A version of Katniss who takes one step further down a path she keeps pulling back from. At face value, Gale is set up as the safe choice. He's the familiar boy from your district, the hunting partner, the one who knows how the games work even before you ever step into an arena. Same trauma, same hatred of the Capitol, same instinct to feed people who would otherwise starve. That part matters because Collins isn't building a clean hero-villain split here. She's building a fork in the road. Here's the real question. If Katniss and Gale start from almost identical conditions, why do they end up on opposite sides of a moral line neither of them can fully see until it's too late? The answer isn't that Gale is secretly evil. It's that he comes to embody a very specific philosophy of resistance. If the Capitol treats people as expendable pieces, then you win by playing the same game better. This is where we talk about utilitarianism without using the textbook word in the text. Gale is the one who argues, even in the first book, that they should have blown up the Capitol ages ago. By catching fire, when Katniss is still trying to keep her family safe and Peeta is trying to preserve individual lives in the arena, Gale is the one scorning survival tactics. Why are we just trying to live, he asks, when we could be fighting? On the surface, that sounds heroic. Underneath, it's the ends justify the means logic that Mockingjay will put on trial. So the question isn't, is Gale evil? The question is, did Collins design him so that if you follow his reasoning all the way to the end, he starts to resemble the people he hates? When he co-designs the double explosion trap for the nut, the narrative doesn't just shrug and move on. It lingers. It shows you civilians. It shows you Gale arguing that fear is necessary. Then, when a nearly identical strategy is used in the Capitol, killing Prim and those children, Katniss can't unsee the relationship between those choices. There is a lot to uncover here in terms of authorial design. The early hunting scenes where Gale jokes about running away, then pivots to wanting to blow up the Capitol. The way the camera in the film starts framing him in war rooms, shoulder to shoulder with Coin's planners. The book's quieter interior moments where Katniss notices that his anger gives him clarity she doesn't trust. We're going to cover how those breadcrumbs build over 3 books and 4 films. The war ethics, the weapon designs, the small glances after Prim's death. And we'll ask why the adaptations lean even harder into making his endpoint feel villainous. Because once you see Gale as Katniss's dark mirror, every heroic decision starts to carry a second, much darker meaning. Roadmap through the ruins. How we're taking Gale apart. So how are we actually going to untangle all of that? Because if Gale is Katniss's dark mirror, we need more than a vibe check. We need to walk through the games of the trilogy the way the story does. Step by step, district by district, war choice by war choice. That's where he's still the hunting partner on the scene, the boy who jokes about running away, but also tosses out lines about blowing up the Capitol long before he's seen an arena. On the surface, he's the safe option back home, the one who doesn't get reaped, the one who represents a future beyond the games. But here's the real question. At face value, is he actually the safe choice, or is Collins already seeding the more ruthless victor the districts will eventually need? Then we move into Catching Fire, where escalation is the whole point. This is where we talk about how Gale shifts from survival to revolution. He's getting whipped in the square. He's calling for uprising. He's scorning the idea of just keeping your head down and hoping the reaping misses you. We'll track the scenes where his anger feels righteous and the ones where it starts to sound eerily close to Capitol logic. Ends over means, numbers over names. That part matters because it sets up whether his Mockingjay choices read as a tragic inevitability or a heel turn. From there, we hit Mockingjay, and we stay there for a while. There is a lot to uncover here. Gale in District 13, Gale in the weapons lab, Gale co-designing the double explosion trap at the nut, that mirrors the parachutes that kill Prim. We'll follow his relationship with Katniss through those war rooms and missions, asking every time, is the narrative condemning him, or just refusing to let anyone walk away clean from these games the Capitol started? Parallel to that, we'll dig into Suzanne Collins herself. What has she actually said about Gale's morality, and where has she stayed completely silent? We'll look at interviews, at how much page time she grants his point of view, at whether she frames him as wrong, early, or just unbearable for Katniss by the end. The reason we care is simple. Authorial intent shapes how harshly we're meant to judge him. We'll also pull the camera back and compare book Gale to movie Gale. Where do the films sharpen his edges, tightening the link between his bonds and Prim's death? And where do they soften him into a wounded soldier? Does screen Gale read as a villain, an anti-hero, or a byproduct of war propaganda in a different set of games? And then we're going to run the wild experiment. We'll reread key scenes. The nut bombing, the children's shield of human bodies in the Capitol, Coin's assassination, as if Gale was always meant to be the hidden villain. How much still fits? Where does the theory break? We'll close by deciding whether Gale was always meant to become the villain, is true, half true, or the wrong question entirely, and how that answer changes your next rewatch. Because once you have that roadmap, every snare he sets, every plan he drafts, suddenly looks very different. Welcome back to the seam. Channel context and your role. So if every snare suddenly looks different, that raises one more uncomfortable issue. What are we doing here on this channel, circling one boy from the seam for over an hour, treating his crush, his rage, and his war crimes with this much scrutiny? At face value, this is a fandom space. But here's the real question. What if Panem is actually one of the best fictional case studies we have for talking about power, propaganda, and the slow corrosion of a person's moral center? This channel is where we talk about the Hunger Games as if some archivist in District 13 just dumped classified files on our desk and said, sort out what really happened. So if you're new, if you just wandered in from the Capitol feed where Gale is either the hot one or the homewrecker, here's what we're going to cover on a regular basis. We take characters the narrative thinks you understand: Snow, Coin, Katniss, Peeta, Johanna, and now Gale, and we pull them apart with a mix of direct textual evidence, adaptation choices, and speculative world building that asks why the system around them pushed them the way it did. We're not doing ship wars, we're doing autopsies, political, emotional, ethical autopsies. There is a lot to uncover here when you stop treating the games as a YA backdrop and start treating them as a decades-long counterinsurgency project run by the Capitol. Why does Snow invest in the Victor's village? Why does Coin weaponize Propo? Why does a boy from the poorest district end up designing bombs that mirror Capitol tactics? Those questions are all the same question. What does it cost to survive in a rigged system? And who pays the bill? If you enjoy this kind of slow burn 80+ minute breakdown of a single moral arc, where one offhand line about blowing up the Capitol in Chapter 1 has to stand trial against Prim's death, this is your Victor's Village. You can move in, metaphorically, by subscribing and sticking around with the regulars who treat every reread as a new investigation. And because this isn't a lecture hall in 13, you're not just an audience, you're part of the case file. I want you to pick a side right now, mentally. Is Gale, in your view at this moment, the villain, the anti-hero, or the tragic victim of a war he was born into? Lock that answer in. Don't overthink it. Pattern interrupt. If your instinct is, it's complicated, the capital thanks you for your cooperation. Hold on to that label and see if it survives contact with the rest of the evidence. That part matters because by the end, when we're standing in front of Snow's mansion with the ashes still falling, your category for Gale might be the thing that changes most. From here, we're going back to the very beginning, back to the seam, back to the fence, back to those early hunting mornings where Gale is just a boy with snares and too many opinions. But this time, we're reading those scenes with the ending in mind, tracking every promise, every flare of anger, every strategic choice, to see what we all missed the first time through. Gale's first hunt, how the story teaches us to trust him. And when you go back, the very first thing the story does is hand you Gale and say, this is safe. This is home. We open in the woods before the reaping, before the arena, before the word victor even really means anything to Katniss. At face value, it's just two teenagers hunting illegally beyond the fence. But here's the real question. Why does Colin spend so much time on Gale's ease out there? He moves through the trees without fear. He knows the snares, the game trails, the rhythm of the forest. The seam is starving, the district is brutal, and yet this little pocket of narrative feels almost peaceful because he's in it. This is where we talk about their shared language, the hand signals, the unspoken cues, the way Katniss and Gale trade banter about the capital, and the games the way other friends might trade gossip. When he jokes about them running away, or fantasizes about living in the woods, it doesn't register as a serious political program. It lands as comfort, as the one place where Katniss can say the quiet part out loud and not die for it. That part matters, because Gale isn't just emotional support, he's structural support. He is literally co-provider. The rabbits, the squirrels, the bread they trade at the hob, those are the calories keeping Prim and Katniss's mother alive. You're told, very concretely, that if Gale doesn't show up at the fence, Katniss's family might not eat. So when he rants about hating the capital or wishing someone would blow it up, you read those lines through a filter of gratitude, of trust. If this boy is the reason Prim isn't dead, how dangerous can his anger really be? We're going to cover his early rhetoric more in a second, because there is a lot to uncover here. On the surface, he's just venting. He complains that the games are rigged, that the districts should rebel, that they should stop entertaining the capital. He even tosses off the idea of blowing up the capital long before he ever touches a real weapon design. In that opening chapter, those comments feel cathartic. You, as a reader, probably agree with him. Someone should blow it up, right? But the reason it feels safe is the point of view. You only ever see Gale through Katniss's eyes, and in book 1, Katniss needs him. She trusts his snares, his judgment, his presence, so his harsher lines get softened by familiarity. When he says, "We could do it, you know. Run away," she rolls her eyes, she teases him. The narration undercuts the seriousness. The text trains you to hear his extremity as background noise, not a warning siren. So here's the question that haunts a reread. If you go back to that same scene knowing about the nut, knowing about Prim, do those early jokes still feel harmless? Or do they start to sound like the first quiet proof that Gale is already comfortable imagining total war? and that the story just wasn't ready to call it out yet. Authorial silence, what Suzanne Collins does and doesn't say about Gale. So if the text is already humming with warning sirens, what does the author do with that? You might expect Suzanne Collins to step in, point at Gale and go, "Yes, that one, that's the problem." But she never does. And that silence is where things get really interesting. At face value, Collins talks a lot about war. In interviews, she's clear that the Hunger Games is about the cost of violence, about trauma echoing down through every district, about what happens when you grow up in a world where the games are just normal. She's also very open about the love triangle not being a soap opera, but a metaphor for different life paths. Peeta represents a future rooted in empathy, in rebuilding relationships and clinging to human connection. Gale represents the path of resistance, the one who channels pain into anger and direct action. This is where we talk about the Peeta versus Gale framing. Collins has basically said, Katniss isn't choosing between two cute boys. She's choosing between two ways of responding to the same wound. Peeta is the victor who refuses to let the Capitol rewrite his mind. Even hijacked, his core struggle is to remember who he is and who he loves. Gale, by contrast, is the one who looks at the same horror and decides the only honest answer is to burn the system down, regardless of collateral damage. That part matters because it tells you the author sees their difference in moral strategy, not just personality. But here's the real question. With all that clarity about themes, why doesn't Collins ever just say, Gale was always meant to become a villain? You can find her explaining why she wrote the games, why she wrote Snow, why Coin exists as a second head of the Hydra. You don't find a neat quote that labels Gale as good, bad, or even officially morally grey. Instead, she keeps pushing you back toward the page. You watch Gale help save hundreds from District 12's firebombing. You watch him get whipped in the square for defiance. Then you watch him co-design the trap at the nut, and you watch Katniss connect that design to the parachutes that kill Prim. Collins doesn't jump in afterward and settle the debate. She lets the discomfort sit there. There is a lot to uncover here about her overall style. Collins consistently resists moral handholding. She gives you victors mentoring children to their deaths, rebels torturing Capitol prisoners, Coin proposing a final symbolic games. She doesn't pause to announce, "This is too far." She trusts you to feel it. Gale's arc follows that exact pattern. Horrifying choices presented almost clinically, with the emotional verdict outsourced to you. So if the author refuses to categorize him, what does that imply? Does that make it more likely he was designed as a dark mirror of Katniss? A what-if version of her rage, rather than a straightforward antagonist? And when you go back through his scenes with that in mind, are you seeing a boy who drifts off course or a carefully planted shadow that only comes into full focus in the final pages? Because the next step is asking whether the story itself, not Collins's interviews, quietly answers that for us. The scene versus the Capitol, how environment shapes Gale's rage. To answer that, we have to zoom out from Gale as a person and look at where he comes from. Because before he's a potential villain, he's a kid from the seam. And the seam is its own kind of weapon. District 12 is basically engineered to grind the hope out of you. In the seam, you wake up to coal dust in your lungs, empty cupboards, and the unspoken math of tesserae How many extra chances will you put your siblings' names into the games for a few months of grain and oil? You see mining deaths treated as routine, public whippings treated as entertainment, and the constant threat that any peacekeeper in a bad mood can end your entire family's stability. Now put that next to the Capitol. Televised parties, skin polish, people betting on which child will die first in the arena while they sip neon drinks. At face value, Panem is one country, one system. But the lived reality is two different planets. And Gale is born on the one designed to kill him slowly. Here's the real question. In that environment, what does anger even look like? For Gale, it starts with something incredibly specific. The mine. His father dies in the same explosion that kills Katniss's. That part matters because it turns the Capitol from an abstract evil into a murderer with a name and address. The same authority that runs the games runs the mines. The same trains that carry tributes to the arena carry coal to fuel Capitol lights. So when Gale says he wants to blow up the Capitol, he's not just being edgy in the woods. He's talking about the system that starved his siblings, killed his father, and then televised other children's deaths as a reminder to stay in line. There is a lot to uncover here, because this is where we talk about why his rage feels both justified and dangerous. Katniss, early on, is focused on tomorrow's meal, next week's trade. Her rebellion is personal, improvisational, rooted in keeping Prim alive. Gale is already thinking in structures. Why should any district have to beg for food when they're the ones doing the labor? Why should the games exist at all? Why not burn the whole thing down so no one's child ever goes again? We're going to cover how that systemic mindset becomes a problem later, but in the seam it reads as clarity. And yet, there's a pattern interrupt here. The same conditions that make his anger rational also normalize mass violence as a reasonable answer. If the Capitol treats your district as disposable, it becomes very easy to start thinking in those same all-or-nothing terms. In Book 1, the narrative mostly lets that sit in the background. Gale's fury is texture, not plot. But once you hand that worldview real weapons and real authority, the relationship between oppressed kid and potential architect of atrocities starts to shift. And the story is about to test what happens when his scene-forged ideas scale up. The game's without Gale, why Collins keeps him off stage, and the story's first move to test that. It actually takes Gale off the board. The moment Katniss is reaped, the narrative slams a door. 1 second you're in the woods with this angry, competent boy who wants to blow up the Capitol. The next, you're on a train with Peeta, Effie, Haymitch, and cameras. At face value, that's just efficient plotting. We follow the tribute into the arena. But here's the real question. Why does Gale almost vanish from the page the second the games truly begin? There is a lot to uncover here. Once the train leaves District 12, Gale becomes a face in the crowd, a cutaway shot on a rooftop screen. The emotional real estate he occupied is suddenly taken over by Peeta's confession, Cinna's designs, the Capitol's excess. That part matters because it lets Gale stay idealized in your head. You never have to watch him starve in front of a feast. You never see him decide whether to kill a child for medicine. The games expose Peeta and Katniss under pressure. Gale is carefully kept off stage. The few glimpses we do get are very controlled. We're told about Gale watching the broadcast, about him having to see Katniss kiss Peeta in a cave, about him standing in the square while the district cheers for their star-crossed lovers. In District 12, he steps into the provider role, supporting Prim and Katniss's mother, hunting alone. The text frames him as the steadfast, suffering supporter, almost a stand-in Victor's family, rather than an active moral agent inside the spectacle itself. He reacts to the games, but he doesn't participate. This is where we talk about strategy, not Gale's, but Collins's. By delaying his direct involvement in rebellion and warfare, she preserves him as the symbol of home, of before. When Katniss is freezing in the arena, she thinks about sharing body heat with Gale on the hillside. When she's forced to perform a romance, she's measuring every capital kiss against real mornings in the woods. The relationship in your mind is built on absence and memory, which is the safest place to store a future problem. So when we hit Catching Fire and Gale finally walks into the center of the political plot, being whipped in the square, arguing for open uprising, you feel a jolt. This isn't the soft focus hunting partner from book 1. This is the scene kid whose blow them up fantasies now have a real audience. By Mockingjay, that instinct has weapon labs and command meetings and a co-designed double explosion trap at the nut. The scale changed. His core didn't. And that's the uncomfortable twist the trilogy sets up without saying it out loud. If in the first book, Gale is the embodiment of home and safety, what does it mean that by the third, Katniss can't go home to him at all? If the games turned her into a reluctant symbol, did keeping Gale out of those same games clear the path for him to become something even more dangerous? We're going to cover what that final break really says about who the story thinks the villain is. From hunter to rebel, Gale's turning point in Catching Fire. So when does Gale stop being the boy you meet in the woods and start becoming the boy who could design the nut? Catching Fire is where that switch flips in public. And it happens in one brutal moment, the whipping. At face value, it's a punishment for poaching. Gale gets caught trying to feed people. The new head peacekeeper makes an example of him. And suddenly, the square becomes an arena. But here's the real question. Why does this scene feel so much more dangerous than any of Gale's earlier "let's blow up the Capitol" lines? Because for the first time, his defiance has a body count. His body, strung up, bleeding in front of the whole district. That part matters because it turns Gale from Katniss's private co-conspirator into a public symbol of District 12's suffering. The Capitol isn't just threatening random miners anymore, they're breaking the boy everyone knows hunts with the victor. When Katniss throws herself over him, when Haymitch and even Peeta step in, you see the relationship web snap tight. The Capitol has accidentally staged a mini rebellion tableau, and Gale is literally at the center of it. After that, he's done with running. Remember those early conversations in the woods where Katniss begs him to run away with her, to take their families into the forest and disappear? Back then, his fantasy is abstract revolution. Now, post-whipping, he rejects escape outright. "I'm not going anywhere," he tells her. The odds are catastrophic, the peacekeepers are harsher, the fence is live, and his response is essentially, "Good. Now we fight." This is where we talk about Gale's rhetoric hardening. When Katniss brings up her promise to protect Prim, her trauma from the games, he increasingly frames those as delays, not reasons. There is a lot to uncover here. For Gale, the real question isn't "how do we keep your family safe?" But how do we make sure no one's family lives under the Capitol again? Her nightmares, her hijacked image as the Mockingjay, even her love triangle become, in his mind, unfortunate side quests to the main campaign. Contrast that with Peeta in the same book. Peeta's whole strategy in the Quarterquell is about protecting Katniss, preserving some shred of humanity inside the games. He throws himself into alliances, public speeches, even that beach scene proposal, not because he thinks he can burn the system down, but because he wants one person to survive it with her soul intact. Gale, meanwhile, is already thinking in terms of districts, uprisings, and acceptable losses. So why does this shift in catching fire matter for the villain question? Because it's the book where Gale quietly becomes a budding strategist. He's talking about coordinated rebellion before Coin ever appears, weighing risk versus reward in ways that ignore Katniss's limits. The games made her a symbol by accident. The whipping helps make him one on purpose. And once you see that, his later choices in Mockingjay stop feeling sudden and start feeling inevitable. The real tension is whether the story will treat that mindset as necessary or unforgivable. We're going to cover how that plays out when his theories finally get real people killed. Is Gale actually wrong or just early? So when Gale spits out, "You haven't hurt people, Katniss. You've given them an opportunity. They just have to be brave enough to take it." What are we actually seeing? A reckless hothead who wants to burn everything down? Or the one person in District 12 who's reading the Capitol correctly before anyone else can bear to? At face value, Catching Fire frames this as a clash of survival strategies. Katniss is still playing a defensive game. Protect Prim, protect Peeta, keep your head down, and maybe the storm will pass. Gale is done with that. He mocks the idea that they can just keep hunting in the woods while the games roll on. Why keep surviving in a system that's designed to grind you down anyway? Here's the real question. Is that cynicism wrong? Or is it the only honest response to what Panem actually is? Because the story does something brutal to answer him. Katniss tries to negotiate, to run, to play Snow's marriage fantasy. Gale gets whipped for poaching, but District 12 still stands. For a minute, his fight-back rhetoric feels premature. And then, the Capitol firebombs the district into ash. The only thing left is Victor's village, this empty monument to a promise that never meant safety. That part matters because it proves Gale wasn't exaggerating the system's brutality. The Capitol really will go all the way. So the narrative doesn't say his anger is wrong, it says it's dangerous. There is a lot to uncover here. Gale consistently reads the political board. Before Katniss does, he understands that the games, the whipping, the quell, are all one continuous war. But the text keeps showing how that clarity blinds him. He sees strategy where Katniss sees faces. He can map out uprisings, bomb routes, long-term gains, but he keeps underestimating individual limits, trauma, and the cost of pushing people past what they can carry. This is where we talk about the ends justify the means problem. Gale in Catching Fire is already arguing that suffering now is the price of freedom later. Coin will repeat that logic almost word for word in Mockingjay. Sacrifices are necessary. Children will die either way. The question is, who controls the board? So does the story condemn that reasoning outright, or only when it's weaponized to the point of targeting children in the Capitol Square? Pattern interrupt. What if the rebellion actually needed a Gale? Without people willing to think in those ruthless tactical terms, do they ever beat Snow? If his mindset is part of why the war is winnable, does that make him less of a villain? Because he's right too early? Or more dangerous? Because being right with no breaks is exactly what turns Coin into a new tyrant. We're going to cover how the finale answers that and why Katniss's final choice is really a verdict on Gale's entire philosophy. Mockingjay's war zone. Gale as weapon, not love interest. Mockingjay does something brutal to Gale that doesn't involve a single bomb. It quietly moves him from Katniss's side to Coin's table. And here's the real question. Once the story starts treating Gale as a weapon instead of a boyfriend, what does that do to how we judge him? Back in District 12, Gale is the boy in the woods, the hunting partner, the shared bread and jokes relationship that promises a future beyond the games. In District 13, he walks into a completely different role. Suddenly, he's in war rooms with Boggs, standing in on Coin's briefings, getting assigned to Star Squad missions. The narrative keeps putting him in rooms he never would have entered at the seam. That part matters because the story is telling you who sees his value now. And it's not Katniss's family. It's the military. Watch how the camera shifts. Earlier, we get those quiet scenes, the shared snare, the stolen moment on the hillside, the talk about running away. Now, most of Gale's page and screen time is in tactical discussions. He's brainstorming bombing patterns at the Nut, debating strategy with Peeta, arguing about acceptable losses. At face value, that's just a character leveling up in a rebellion. But the framing is cold. His worth is measured in how effectively he can hurt the capital, not in how well he understands Katniss. This is where we talk about his harsher tactics. At the Nut, Gale proposes trapping workers inside, collapsing the mountain even if it means massive civilian casualties. He's the one who suggests targeting peacekeepers' families, reasoning that fear will break the capital's grip. Other characters flinch. Boggs hesitates. Katniss is nauseated. Even Coin has to package these ideas in cleaner language. The narrative reaction is clear. His logic works, but it feels wrong in your gut. So why does he keep being the one to say the quiet part out loud? Notice what quietly disappears while all this is happening. The love triangle. We're told it's still a question, Peeta or Gale. But in Mockingjay, Gale's scenes are rarely about romance. They're about whether Katniss will sign off on his brand of total war. Their arguments aren't, who do you love? They're what are you willing to do and who are you willing to become? The supposed romantic rival turns into a walking referendum on the rebellion's ethics. There is a lot to uncover here because that pivot is the point. Gale stops being the boy she might build a life with and becomes the embodiment of a dangerous idea that the only way to beat the capital is to become just as ruthless. The story keeps rewarding his competence while surrounding his choices with dread. So when Coin eventually uses a weapon that looks eerily similar to his designs, you've already been primed to connect his philosophy to that final atrocity. The next step is asking whether the narrative is condemning Gale himself or warning you about what happens when a traumatized district starts mistaking effective weapons for heroes. The Nut bombing, Gale's ethics go on record. So if Gale's philosophy is dangerous, where does the story actually put it on paper? This is where we talk about the Nut. You're in District 2 now, a mountain fortress carved out and fortified over decades. The capital's military heart, but also full of district workers, support staff, people who grew up being told this was their only path to survival. At face value, the strategic question is simple. How do the rebels neutralize the nut without throwing thousands of their own fighters into a meat grinder? A direct assault is suicide. Doing nothing means the capital keeps air power and weapons. So why does the solution end up sounding eerily close to a war crime? We're going to cover the plan Gale brings to the table. He suggests bombing the entrances and exits, not to blow the whole mountain, but to seal it. Trap everyone inside. Anyone who tries to dig out or escape gets picked off by rebel sharpshooters. Anyone who stays inside risks suffocating, starving, or being crushed as ventilation fails. Gale knows this. He names it, and he accepts it. The workers, the low-level peacekeepers, the kids who grew up in that district's shadow, collateral. Here's the real question. Why is Gale so willing to write off those lives? In his mind, the nut isn't a workplace, it's a weapon. Anyone who remains there after the warning is to him choosing the capital, choosing the games, choosing to keep the system that killed Rue and Cinna and Thresh running. He tells Katniss that people in 2 had a choice, that if they stay inside, their deaths are on them. That part matters because it shows you his internal courtroom. Once he's decided you're complicit, your life weighs less on the scale. Katniss pushes back hard. She's horrified by the image of miners and mechanics sealed underground, of people who might not even hear the warning in time. She's the one who remembers that districts are conditioned, threatened, bribed with the promise of food and safety. She knows the relationship between survival and obedience. So when she argues that the workers are trapped in the system, not masterminding it, she's defending the concrete, terrified people in the nut right now, not an abstract future Panem. Gale, though, is doing textbook utilitarian math. Sacrifice thousands to end the war faster, save tens of thousands later. It's the trolley problem with ventilation shafts and avalanche charges. And the narrative lets that argument sit there. It doesn't step in with a neon sign saying Gale is wrong, but it does something quieter. It anchors you in Katniss's revulsion, then shows Coin later using a nearly identical double blast concept on capital children. So when Katniss eventually connects Prim's death to this style of thinking, it isn't sudden. The nut is the rehearsal. The real question is whether the story is blaming Gale for crossing a line or warning you that in Panem, everyone who wins the war ends up standing on that same line. And the next scene we're heading into pushes that even further. Echoes of the parachutes. Coin, Gale, and shared tactics. So when those silver parachutes start drifting down over the capital children, you're meant to feel déjà vu. We've seen this trick before. Only last time, it was buried in a mountain called the Nut, and Gale was proud of it. Structurally, the 2 attacks are twins. That part matters because the story is almost waving a red flag at you. At the Nut, Beatty and Gale design a strike where the first wave of bombs collapses the mountain entrances, trapping workers inside. Then they plan for a delayed second explosion, timed for when medics and rescuers rush in. 2 stages. First hit the targets, then hit the people trying to help. When you watch the parachutes in the capital, the rhythm is the same. Initial blast, screams, then a second coordinated detonation that wipes out the rescuers and the surviving children. At face value, Coin could have come up with that on her own. War is full of atrocities. Panem isn't special there. But here's the real question. Why does the book go out of its way to show you Gale and Peeta building this exact template first? We're going to cover authorial intent later, but in text, it's very plausible that Coin's weapons lab is using their designs, or at least their shared philosophy. Peeta is the capital's own tech genius turned rebel. Gale is the district-born strategist willing to push every boundary. Together, they prototype a new kind of game's logic, turn compassion itself into a trap. This is where we talk about Katniss's point of view because the narrative locks you inside her head at the worst possible moment. After Prim dies, Katniss doesn't run through a list of suspects. She jumps straight to the nut, to Gale, to that conversation where he explains the double explosion concept. The relationship between those memories is immediate and poisonous. She thinks, essentially, this is his kind of weapon. And once she's made that mental connection, there's no going back to hunting in the woods. Pattern interrupt for a second. The book never actually proves he did it. We don't get a schematic with Gale's name on it. We don't see a scene where Coin says, use his design. There is a lot to uncover here about ambiguity. Suzanne Collins leaves just enough overlap that you can't convict him in a courtroom sense. What you can do is watch Katniss quietly hand down her own verdict. So is this the moment Gale becomes the villain in her story? Or is he just the most visible embodiment of a broader war ethic that Coin and Snow share? The reason this hits so hard is that the text refuses to separate those questions. Gale might not push the button in the Capitol, but the moral architecture of that attack is his. In a world built on games, he's the victor of a different arena. The one where you win by being willing to do what no one else will. And once Katniss sees that, how can she ever build a future with him, even if he walks away legally clean? The next step is to ask whether the narrative is punishing Gale for being wrong or for being terrifyingly close to right. Is Gale responsible for Prim's death? So here's the uncomfortable knot at the center of all this. When Prim dies in that second wave of parachutes, is Gale actually responsible, or is he just the closest thing Katniss can grab onto in a world where cause and effect have completely broken down? At face value, the Fandom's verdict is simple. He helped invent a double explosion trap at the nut. A double explosion trap kills Prim. Case closed. But here's the real question. What kind of responsibility are we talking about? There is a lot to uncover here, and it helps to split it into 3 layers. First, literal responsibility. Did Gale physically design those exact Capitol parachutes? In Mockingjay, we see him and Peeta working in 13's weapons lab, brainstorming compounded mines that draw in rescuers with a first blast, then detonate again. That part matters because the nut attack runs on this concept, but the time Coin is orchestrating the final assault on the Capitol, Peeta has full access to 13's tech. Coin has motive to sacrifice Capitol children, and neither of them actually needs Gale in the room to adapt an idea that's already on the table. We never get a scene where someone says, Gale signed off on the parachutes. What we get is Plutarch vaguely confirming that 13 had the capability, and Katniss mentally tracing the similarity back to that weapons brainstorm with Gale. The text leaves just enough fog that you can't prove he coded the trigger, but you can't prove he didn't either. The movies tighten this connection, visually echoing the nut and the Capitol square so your brain links them, even if the script doesn't spell it out. Second, strategic responsibility. Even if Beatty and Coin did the technical work, the philosophy behind that weapon, the willingness to target responders, to weaponize compassion, is exactly what Gale has been arguing for since Catching Fire. You hear it when he talks about blowing up the nuts' entrances, trapping workers inside. You feel it when he dismisses individual lives for the sake of the district or the rebellion. In a story obsessed with games logic, he's the one pushing a winner-takes-all, no-mercy rulebook. So is the narrative blaming him for inventing a style of war the Capitol then mirrors back? Or is it saying that once you normalize that tactic in your own arsenal, you don't get to be shocked when your leaders use it on the people you love? Third, emotional responsibility. This is where we talk about Katniss. She watches her sister walk into a cloud of Capitol-branded aid and never walk out. There is no good reason for it, no satisfying Capitol plot twist that makes it make sense. So her mind reaches for a chain of causality she can survive. If Coin used a Gale-style weapon, then cutting Gale out becomes a way to draw a line. This is where the games end for me. You can read Gale as a scapegoat for trauma she can't process, or as genuinely culpable for opening the door to that kind of horror. The story refuses to fully resolve it. But it does make one thing feel inevitable. Even if Gale never pushed the final button, he's standing close enough to the blast that her rejection of him lands as tragic, and, in the brutal moral math of Panem, almost unavoidable. The next step is asking whether that inevitability was baked in from his very first hunting trip with Katniss, or whether war slowly rewrote who he was allowed to be. Book Gale versus movie Gale, who's darker? So if Gale standing next to that final blast feels inevitable, we have to ask something uncomfortable. Does the story make him darker, or do the movies do that for us? Because once you shift from the page to the screen, his trajectory doesn't just feel tragic. It feels weaponized. On the page, Gale disappears for long stretches. In the Hunger Games, you meet him in the woods, hear his anger at the Capitol, then he's mostly a memory while the games play out. Even in Catching Fire, he's back in District 12, beaten for defending a woman, but still off stage for the big Capitol and arena sequences. The rebellion is happening around him. In the films, we're going to cover the exact opposite experience. The camera drags him into the center of the board early. You see him watching Katniss's interviews, standing in the square during Snow's speech, physically present in District 13's war rooms. That part matters because more screen time means more stated ideology. At face value, he's still the same character. Furious, strategic, obsessed with freeing his district. But here's the real question. When you actually hear him argue for those choices, does he still feel morally grey, or does he tip into something harsher? The Mockingjay movies add or amplify key beats. You don't just hear about the nut strategy, you watch Gale defend it on screen, insisting they can't let anyone escape, fully aware civilians will die. His confrontations with Peeta are sharpened too. Book Gale resents Peeta, sure, but film Gale spits lines that frame Peeta's mercy as weakness, turning their relationship into a clear clash between utilitarian sacrifice and individual hope. And this is where we talk about visual storytelling. On the page, bombs go off can sit in your brain as an abstraction. In the movie, you see the tunnels collapsing, hear the screams, watch Katniss process it in real time while Gale holds his ground. The same logic applies to the parachute bombs. Even though the film never has Gale say, "I built that exact trap," the earlier scenes of him designing similar weapons glue his face to those explosions in your mind. Once you've watched children burn, it's a lot harder to keep Gale safely in your morally flexible headcanon. But the films don't just paint him as a cartoon villain, and that's important. We watch him carry Prim to the bunker in Catching Fire, see his devastation over District 12's ashes, feel his heartbreak every time Katniss chooses the games, or Peeta over the simple hunting life they promised each other. The camera lingers on his reactions, the flinch when Katniss kisses Peeta, the way his voice cracks when he talks about bombing the Capitol. There is a lot to uncover here, because those shots keep reminding you this is still a boy from the seam, not President Snow in a different jacket. So what are the films really doing? Are they just turning the book's subtext into text, making it impossible to ignore the darker implications Suzanne Collins already wrote? Or do they push him one step further, bending him toward villain territory in a way the novels stop just short of? The next piece of this puzzle is whether that shift changes the entire question of who the real enemy of the story is, and that's where we're headed next. Pattern break. What if Gale had been the protagonist? So let's break the pattern for a second. Instead of asking whether Gale turns into the villain of Katniss's story, what happens if we flip the camera and say, this was Gale's trilogy all along? In that version, you don't start in the arena, you start in the woods. A boy whose father was killed in a mining explosion the Capitol never answers for. A boy who keeps his district family alive by breaking the law every single day. At face value, that's already a pretty standard hero setup. Orphaned, angry, forced into responsibility too early. Katniss becomes the one left behind. She's the hunting partner who disappears into the games while our main character is stuck in District 12 watching the broadcasts. Powerless. We're going to cover those same events, but through a screen in the hob instead of a bow in the arena. You'd see Gale raging when she volunteers, smashing snares when the Capitol parades her as their new symbol of hope. Here's the real question. If the Capitol killed your father, starved your siblings, and turned your best friend into propaganda, how extreme do your thoughts have to get before the audience stops rooting for you? Because from Gale's POV, every escalation has a reason. The whipping in Catching Fire, that's not a warning sign. That's the moment the cruel peacekeeper system literally brands him for refusing to play along. He's punished for trading to keep his district alive. Classic martyr beat. Then the bombing of 12 happens. In Gale's story, that's his "your home planet just exploded" moment. He runs back into a burning district to pull people out, drags them toward the only shelter left, the victor's village, and watches almost everything else turn to ash. That part matters because when District 13 offers him a uniform and a purpose, it doesn't read as him selling his soul. It reads as the first time an authority figure says, "We need your brain. We need your rage." This is where we talk about the weapons. From Katniss's angle, co-designing traps with BT feels cold, even before the nut. But if you're sitting inside Gale's head, those blueprints are the only way he can fight back against a Capitol that has been perfecting child-killing technology for 75 years. He's not inventing cruelty out of nowhere. He's mirroring the games back at their creators and saying, you don't get to be the only one who makes the rules. And notice how many traits we usually celebrate in war protagonists suddenly look suspicious only because the narrative lens moved. strategic ruthlessness, willingness to accept casualties. In a different franchise, that's the hardened resistance leader who does what the softer characters can't. Think about how many stories reward the person who says, "We blow up their base now, or they'll kill more of us later." A huge reason is relationship and POV. You're anchored to Katniss's horror, to Prim's face, to Peeta's insistence that I want to show them they don't own me. The camera cuts away from Gale's justifications and lingers on the bodies. Suddenly, the hero line moves. There is a lot to uncover here, but the pattern interrupt is useful. If a simple POV swap can turn Gale into a tragic war hero, maybe Collins isn't trying to hand you a clear villain at all. Maybe she's asking a harder question about what kind of person war promotes and what it quietly discards once the games are over. And if Gale isn't the neat villain, then who is the story quietly training you to fear instead? That's where we're headed next. Gale versus Peeta. Two answers to the same trauma. So if Gale isn't the neat, mustache-twirling villain, then why does the story still make you afraid of where he ends up? To answer that, you have to put him next to the one person the narrative keeps telling you to trust, Peeta. On paper, they start in almost the same place. Two boys from a starving district, both grow up under capital punishment, both know what it means to watch their families hover on the edge of death. Katniss meets Gale in the woods, illegally hunting to keep their households alive. She meets Peeta through bread thrown out a back door, the moment that literally saves her from starving. Same system, same game's orbit, but two completely different instincts about what you do with that pain. Gale's first answer to the capital is simple: fight, blow it up. From the very first book, he's talking about running away or starting a war, about how he hates the people in the capital enough to kill them. Survival is important, but only as a step towards destroying the system that made survival this hard in the first place. That part matters because his moral math always runs through the question, will this hurt the capital? He doesn't believe he can topple the games overnight, so he focuses on the one thing he can control, his own humanity. In the training center, when he tells Katniss he wants to show them they don't own me, he's not talking about a bigger bomb. He's talking about refusing to become the capital's monster, even if he dies in the arena. At face value, that sounds softer than Gale's rage. But here's the real question. In a world built on spectacle and death, which resistance is harder, picking up a weapon, or refusing to become a weapon? We're going to cover this more when we talk about war ethics, but watch how often Peeta explicitly rejects Gale-style thinking. In Catching Fire, his priority in the Quarter Quell is saving Katniss and the other tributes, not maximizing capital casualties. In Mockingjay, even through hijacking and torture, his horror at mass punishment keeps breaking through. He calls out the Propo, he questions Coin, he worries about the cost to individual people who will never be named in a speech. This is where we talk about Katniss caught between them, not just in a love triangle, but in a philosophical triangle. Gale offers the promise of escalating resistance. If the capital hurt you, you hurt them back worse. Peeta offers the promise of clinging to personhood. If the capital turns everything into a game, you refuse to play by their rules, even when you're forced onto the board. If Gale is Katniss's dark mirror, Peeta is her moral anchor. Choosing him at the end isn't just about romance. It's a decision between two ethical frameworks. Do you build a future on perfected strategy, or on the fragile, infuriating choice to protect small lives even when justice feels incomplete? And why does the story reward one and quietly exile the other? That's where we're headed next. War, trauma, and the making of a villain. If Peeta is the moral anchor and Gale is the dark mirror, then we have to ask, how does a boy who once risked a whipping to protect a girl in the Hob end up designing traps that treat civilians as acceptable losses? Here's the real question. Is Gale born a villain, or does Panem build him? This is where we talk about war as a machine that eats people's ethics. Gale's life is a conveyor belt of trauma. He grows up in grinding District 12 poverty, shouldering adult responsibility the second his father dies in the mine explosion that also shatters Katniss's family. The games then take his best friend away every year as a potential corpse on a screen. When Katniss is reaped, he has to watch the person he hunts with, laughs with, maybe loves, be turned into capital entertainment. And it doesn't stop there. He's publicly whipped in the square for trying to protect a woman from the peacekeepers. He watches the capital annihilate his entire district, reduced to ash except for the eerie shell of Victor's village. Then he's thrown into frontline combat in Mockingjay, where the games are now urban warfare, mass graves, and constant dehumanization. That part matters because trauma isn't just a sad backstory detail, it's a psychological pressure cooker. Psychological research on trauma and radicalization tells us that prolonged exposure to violence and powerlessness pushes people toward absolutist ends justify the means thinking. When every authority in your life proves that mercy is punished and brutality wins, your brain starts to rewrite the rules. Why bother clinging to nuance when nuance gets your family bombed? Utilitarian all-or-nothing strategies can feel not only logical, but moral. Apply that lens to Gale, and his arc stops looking random. His increasing willingness to accept civilian casualties at the nut, his interest in efficient traps, his cold analysis of capital weaknesses, none of that appears in a vacuum. It's a survival strategy in a world that has taught him the capital will never reciprocate mercy. The promise he makes to himself is simple: never be powerless again, no matter the cost. And Katniss, she's not morally untouched either. By the end, she's numb, dissociated, ready to kill President Coin in front of the entire new government. She votes for a symbolic final Hunger Games on Capitol children. She is absolutely brushing up against the same dehumanization Gale lives in. She just breaks in a different direction, turning her violence on the system's architect instead of on faceless enemies. So is Gale wrong? Or is he what happens when a righteous kid is marinated in war too long? At face value, calling him a villain is satisfying, but it also lets Panem off the hook. There is a lot to uncover here, because Gale isn't just a bad guy to be condemned and forgotten. He's a warning about what war does to the very people who most desperately wanted justice. And if that's true, what does it say about the story that Katniss can't forgive him, even when she understands exactly how he got there? Gale and Coin, why their alliance feels so uncomfortable. And that's where Coin walks in. Because once we shift from Gale the boy in the woods to Gale the strategist in 13, this is where we talk about his relationship with power. Suddenly, he's not just arguing with Katniss over a squirrel, he's standing next to President Coin, presenting plans that decide who lives and who dies. At face value, they're both on the right side. Rebels. Freedom. the promise of a better Panem. But here's the real question. Why does their alliance feel so deeply wrong? Coin's leadership style is our first red flag. She runs District 13 like a spreadsheet. Schedules, rations, troop numbers, propaganda output. She sees the war as a set of variables to be optimized, not lives to be grieved. When she talks, it's always about optics. How Katniss polls, how the districts will respond, how many bodies it costs to move the front line an inch. That part matters because Gale fits into that machine almost too well. Watch how quickly he becomes her favorite weapon. In Mockingjay, he's at the war table with Peeta, designing traps, discussing maximum impact and minimal resources. When he suggests the double explosion at the nut bombs that hit rescuers after the first wave, Coin isn't horrified. She's intrigued. They're on the same side of the argument. Harsher tactics, long-term victory over short-term mercy. Katniss is the one flinching. Gale and Coin are the ones nodding. Visually and thematically, the story keeps putting them together. Gale in the uniform, Gale in the strategy meetings, Gale backing Coin when she pushes Katniss to perform for the propo instead of rest. You start to notice a pattern. Whenever there's a choice between saving specific people now or increasing the odds of winning later, Gale and Coin land in the same place. Sacrifice the few, protect the many, move the numbers. And that's exactly when Katniss's distrust of Coin starts to bleed into how she sees Gale. She doesn't just dislike Coin's haircut, she senses the authoritarian core under the rebel branding. Coin delays rescue missions if they're not useful for the cameras. She toys with the idea of a symbolic final Hunger Games using capital children. Then Katniss realizes something terrifying. Gale is comfortable with those same principles. He's already signed off on a strategy that doesn't flinch at the thought of children in a blast radius. Does Gale see it? Or is he so focused on defeating Snow that he never looks up to notice he's helping build a new Snow with better PR? The story never gives us a scene where he fully confronts Coin's authoritarian tendencies. He questions tactics in the field, sure, but he doesn't question the system he's feeding. His righteous anger gets poured straight into her war machine. And that's the uncomfortable punchline. Their alliance isn't just a plot convenience. It's a warning. There is a lot to uncover here, because Gale's arc shows how easily the boy who wanted to burn the games down becomes the tool of the next regime. So when Coin proposes one last Hunger Games using capital children as tributes, the real question becomes, how far is Gale already down that road? And is there any way back? The job in the capital, Gale's ending as narrative judgment. So when Coin proposes one last Hunger Games, and we're asking how far Gale is already down that road, the story quietly answers with one line in the epilogue era wrap-up. He's in the capital, not just surviving, employed. In a fancy job, at face value, that sounds good, right? He got out. He's safe. He has a future in the heart of power, while Katniss is basically in exile, wandering the ashes of District 12. But here's the real question. Why does the boy who wanted to blow the capital off the map end up on its payroll? This is where we talk about narrative judgment. Collins doesn't give Gale a dramatic trial, no public reckoning for the nut, or for Prim. Instead, she gives him a transfer. He goes from the seam to the center, from hunter to high-level operative. Meanwhile, Katniss is sent home to the ruins, and Peeta is literally rebuilding bread by bread, memory by memory. That contrast is not subtle. Think about the symbolism of geography. Katniss and Peeta return to the district that was bombed for their existence, living in a half-abandoned victor's village that was already a monument to the games. Their reward is space, obscurity, and the fragile promise that no one will ever ask them to wield power again. Gale, who always believed in using power harder and earlier, is absorbed into the new regime's machine. So is this a reward, a punishment, or a tragic irony? On paper, he wins. He has status, influence, probably a clean uniform instead of coal dust. But the cost is baked in. He is cut off from the person he spent 3 books fighting for, from the district identity that shaped his anger, from the community whose suffering gave his rhetoric weight. There is a lot to uncover here, because that part matters because it mirrors his own utilitarian choices. Trade one thing you love for a broader good you can't fully see. We're going to cover whether that sounds more like a villain ending or a survivor ending. Villains in this world don't always die. Snow dies, sure, but Coin almost takes the presidency, and Plutarch just keeps working. The system recycles the people who are most comfortable making hard, distant decisions. Gale's job in the capital quietly puts him in that lineage. But he's not framed with the theatrical evil of snow. There's no mustache twirling, no final monologue. Instead, his fate lands in that uneasy middle space. You're left asking, did he sell out? Or was he always built for this? Did the capital corrupt him? Or did it simply recognize a familiar mindset and offer him a desk? And what does it say that Katniss can't even bring herself to visit? That unanswered relationship is the story's final verdict, and it sets up the last piece we need to examine. What Gale's arc tells us about the kind of violence Panem is willing to forgive, and who it never will. Fandom on trial. How we turned Gale into the bad guy. So here's the twist. The story never gives us a courtroom scene for Gale, but Fandom absolutely does. Once the books and movies ended, the discourse trial began. Suddenly, Gale isn't Katniss's hunting partner from the seam. He's Prim's killer, the toxic masculinity option, the boy who never understood her. At face value, those takes feel obvious. He designs a trap, a version of that trap kills Prim, and he tells Katniss early on that he'd rather blow up the capital than play its games. But here's the real question. How much of that verdict lives in the text? And how much did we build ourselves, meme by meme? This is where we talk about Team Peeta versus Team Gale. The books already invite comparison, bread versus snares, mercy versus strategy, the victor who promises protection versus the rebel who promises revolution. But the marketing pushes it further. Posters, hashtags, fan edits. You're not just asking what's the ethical response to war trauma in District 12, you're asking whose boyfriend is better. And once you pick a team, every scene becomes evidence. Gale, yelling at Katniss in Catching Fire, proof he's controlling. Peeta defending her in the interviews, proof he's the good one. Nuance gets cross-examined out of existence. Online, that part matters because short formats reward the sharpest angle. A 3-book moral spiral becomes a 10-second clip of Gale saying, "I'm in pain." That's the only way I get your attention. Overlaid with red flags, the long, messy relationship between 2 traumatized teenagers collapses into a diagnosis: abuser, villain, or if you're on the other side, misunderstood war hero. And then the movies quietly stack the deck. In Mockingjay, the visual parallels between Gale's double bomb concept at the Nut and Coin's attack on the Capitol, children are crystal clear. The same logic, the same delayed explosion, the same horror on Katniss's face. We're going to cover the adaptation choices more later, but for Fandom, that one parallel becomes the smoking gun. Edit Gale's plan. Cut to Prim's death. Add a caption. He did this. The Capitol couldn't design better propaganda, but the trial isn't one-sided. There is a lot to uncover here in the counter-fandom that rushes to defend him. You'll see threads arguing Gale is no worse than Katniss, Boggs, or Beatty, pointing out that every rebel leader in this war signs off on tactics that kill civilians. Some readers insist he's a tragic figure, punished for voicing the hard truths too early, that his only real crime is refusing the comforting lie that anyone walks away clean. So we end up with two Gales, the secret villain of the trilogy and the scapegoat for a rebellion everyone participated in. Which version feels more true to you? And why did you choose him? Because if Fandom can turn Gale Hawthorne into a meme villain, what else has our post-release conversation quietly rewritten about Panem? That's where we're going next, and it might change who you think this story is really condemning. Pattern break. 3 alternate Gales that never happened. So let's break the pattern for a second. Not, is Gale a villain, but how many tiny choices did it take to get us to that version of him at all? Because if you nudge the story an inch, you get a completely different Gale. Version 1, Gale dies in catching fire. Either he doesn't survive the whipping in the square, or he's one of the unnamed bodies in the District 12 bombings. At face value, that's tragic background detail. But here's the real question. Would anyone be calling that Gale a monster on TikTok edits? No. He freezes in place as the boy who raged against the Capitol and never had the power to act on it. His "we could blow them up" speeches stay hypothetical, the kind of thing you forgive because the games are brutal and he's hurting. He becomes Rue Plus, a martyr the narrative can mourn without ever testing how far his anger would go. Version 2, same history up through the Nut, different decision after. Imagine Gale watches the mountain fall, hears the screams, and instead of doubling down with Beatty and Coin, he flinches. He hears Boggs talk about using every weapon and realizes he's becoming what he hates. This is where we talk about refusal. He steps away from strategy, starts running supply lines, focuses on refugees from the districts instead of weapons for the Capitol assault. Does he still have blood on his hands? Absolutely. But the arc bends towards self-awareness. The relationship between intention and consequence shifts. He stops treating people as chess pieces and starts treating them as patients. Would you still label him the villain, or the soldier who pulled back from the edge a little too late? Version 3 might be the most uncomfortable. Gale survives the war and stays in District 12. No fancy job in 2, no clean narrative exit. He's in the rebuilt seam, while Katniss and Peeta occupy those eerie Victor's Village houses that once symbolized the Capitol's promise of safety. There is a lot to uncover here. Every market day he sees Prim's empty absence. Every time a child runs past, Katniss has to decide whether to look at him or look away. The 3 of them rebuild the district's life together, under that constant pressure? Does the slow, daily work of repairing homes and planting crops redeem his war choices, or just keep scraping the wound open? Across all three, the core question doesn't change. Is Gale inherently a villain, or did the narrative steer him there? Collins could have frozen him as a martyr, broken him into a penitent ex-soldier, or trapped him in a long, quiet reckoning at home. She didn't. She chose the path where his tactical brilliance scales up, his empathy fails to keep pace, and his final moral label hangs on a handful of key decisions. That part matters because it suggests design, not accident. If Gale can swing this far on a few different choices, what does it say that the story locks him into the most morally compromised version? In the next section, we're going to cover what that implies about authorial intent and who the trilogy is quietly warning you not to become. The dark mirror test. How closely does Gale track Katniss? So if the trilogy is warning you not to become Gale, the next step is brutal but necessary. You have to ask, how close does Katniss actually get to being him? At face value, they look like narrative opposites. She's the reluctant symbol, he's the eager revolutionary. But here's the real question. Why do their lives line up almost beat for beat before the war pulls them apart? Both lose their fathers in the same mine explosion. Both are shoved into the role of provider before they're old enough to vote in a reaping. Both learn to hunt, to break the capital's laws, to kill animals without flinching because their families' lives depend on it. That part matters because it means Gale isn't some random foil dropped in from a different story. He's built from the same raw material. When you watch them in the woods in Book 1, sharing bread and plotting escape, you're seeing two possible futures for the same personality. They hate the games. They hate the capital. They both dream of a district where they don't have to trade their trauma for food. So where do we start to see the dark mirror? It's in their ruthlessness, and it shows up way earlier than Mockingjay. Katniss kills Marvel almost on instinct after Rue is speared. There's no hesitation, no speech, no moral debate. She's a hunter who has just watched a child she loved die. Later, she agrees, however bitterly, to Coin's proposal for a symbolic Hunger Games using capital children. That is a horrifying sentence, but the story makes her say yes. Now put that next to Gale's harshest choices. He's the one who wants to blow up the capital long before there's a functional rebellion. He's the one who co-designs the double explosion trap at the nut, fully aware it will catch medics and wounded in the second blast. In the film, he even defends the idea more directly, arguing that this is how you win. You can feel the relationship between those scenes and Katniss's own decisions. Same logic, different thresholds. This is where we talk about divergence. Katniss's breaking point is painfully clear. Violence touches Prim, and the entire strategic framework collapses. She can't justify anything that even smells like that tactic ever again. But Gale's breaking point? We never see it. He doesn't get a moment where he looks at what he's done and says, "Enough." The narrative cuts away before he's forced to confront a line he won't cross. There is a lot to uncover here, because that absence is intentional. Gale exists to externalize one path Katniss could have taken, the version of her that leans fully into calculated violence, never pulls back, and never has a Prim-level cost to force a reckoning. He's her skill set plus her anger, without her final refusal. Reading him as a dark mirror instead of a mustache-twirling villain keeps him complicated and keeps the trilogy's core question in focus. In war, what kind of victor do you become, and when do you decide the games are over for you? In the next section, we're going to cover how the adaptations answer that question, and how pushing Gale further into villain territory changes the promise of the story. So, was Gale always meant to become the villain? So, was this always the destination? When you step back from the love triangle drama and just track Gale's arc, you start to wonder if the story has been quietly steering him toward that morally dangerous edge from the very first snare he sets in the woods. At face value, the yes, he was always meant to be a villain case is strong. In Book 1, before Katniss even enters the arena, Gale is already talking about blowing up the Capitol, fantasizing about hunting peacekeepers, treating the games as a rigged system you answer with force, not performance. By catching fire, that rhetoric escalates. He mocks the idea of playing along, pushes for open rebellion, and starts valuing strategic impact over individual safety in a way that clashes hard with Peeta's instinct to protect specific people. This is where we talk about the nut in Mockingjay. Gale co-designs the double explosion trap. Bomb once, wait for medics, bomb again. The narrative then pairs that exact logic with the parachutes that kill Prim. Katniss doesn't know if Gale signed off on Coin's attack, but she can't unsee the relationship between his idea and her sister's death. But here's the real question. Does that automatically make him the villain, or is that label doing something the text itself refuses to do? There is a lot to uncover here. Gale is a product of District 12 starvation, of years of tesserae, of watching his father die in the mines the same way Katniss lost hers. His radicalism isn't born in a vacuum. It's a response to a world where the Capitol has already been bombing, torturing, and reaping children for decades. He genuinely loves Katniss. He genuinely loves Prim. His first defining trait is that he feeds other people's kids when their parents die. And crucially, Suzanne Collins never gives us an authorial speech saying, Gale was wrong, full stop. The punishment he gets is emotional exile, not a villain monologue and a dramatic fall. So the middle ground answer is this. Gale isn't written to become the big bad. He's written to move toward a morally hazardous place and then stop just short of full condemnation. He's Katniss's dark mirror, the version of her that lets hatred and strategy run the whole board. That part matters because it turns him into a critique of a certain kind of resistance, the kind that starts with justice and drifts into pure calculus about acceptable losses. The films turn the dial a little further. They make the subtext text, giving him extra lines defending harsh tactics, tightening the visual parallel between his bombs at the nut and Coin's final attack, and holding on Katniss's face when she connects Prim's death to his methods. But they aren't inventing a villain from nothing, they're amplifying seeds the books already planted. So where does that leave us? With a character designed to make you squirm, to ask whether, in his place, with his grief and rage, you'd make the same choices, and whether you'd even notice when you crossed the line from rebel to something the Capitol would recognize all too well. In the next section, we're going to cover how the adaptations frame those choices on screen and what happens when a story that blurs hero and villain has to pick a side for the camera. What Gale's arc says about hope, fear, and revolution. So when you step back from the nut, from the parachutes, from that final look Katniss gives, Gale, you hit a bigger question. What does his whole arc actually say about hope, fear, and the way revolutions can start to look a lot like the systems they're trying to destroy? This is where we talk about Snow's favorite equation. He tells Seneca that hope is the only thing stronger than fear, but it has to be contained. A little hope, dosed out through the games, through victors, through the promise that if your district plays along, maybe your children won't starve. At face value, Gale is the opposite of that. He's been wanting to blow up the capital since the seam. No pageantry, no patience. Just rip the system out by the roots. But here's the real question. When he helps design traps that treat human bodies as moving pieces on a board, how far is he from Snow's own logic? Snow accepts civilian deaths as the cost of stability. Gale accepts civilian deaths as the cost of liberation. Different goal, same willingness to turn people into numbers. That part matters because the series keeps asking whether changing who holds power actually changes how that power operates. Enter Coin. Snow weaponizes fear with a drip of hope. Coin weaponizes hope with a drip of fear. She doesn't threaten you with the games. She promises you an end to them. A better Panem, a better district, a world where no child is reaped again as long as you accept mass bombings, secret weapons programs, and one last symbolic Hunger Games for balance. Gale becomes the bridge here, the oppressed boy from 12 whose strategies fit a president's agenda a little too well. When he stands in that war room in Mockingjay, calmly walking Coin through blast patterns, you're watching the relationship between rebel and ruler blur. Is he serving the revolution, or is the revolution already serving the next capital? There is a lot to uncover here, but one core piece is simple. Gale's story is a cautionary tale about revolutions that never interrogate their own methods. If your freedom plan requires bombing children to break the enemy's will, how different are you from the original architects of the games? The narrative doesn't answer that with a speech. It answers it with Prim's body on the pavement and Katniss's silence when Gale tries to explain. And then Katniss does the one thing neither Snow nor Coin expects. In the execution arena, she points the arrow at Coin instead of Snow. It's a refusal to endorse a system that just rebrands the games under a new name, even if that choice shatters her politically and personally. She doesn't become the new victor president, she retreats to 12, effectively exiled from the revolution she helped win. So Gale ends up embodying the temptation to fight horror with horror, to answer the capital's fire with something even hotter. Katniss embodies the painful, imperfect refusal to fully cross that line. Together, they reinforce the series' warning. If you don't question the rules of the games, they'll just keep running, with new tributes, new arenas, and a new face on the balcony. In the next section, we're going to cover how the films lean into that contrast visually, and what they choose to soften or sharpen about Gale's role in that cycle. Rewatch challenge, seeing Gale with new eyes. So now that we've pulled apart that contrast between refusing the line and stepping over it, here's the real question. What happens if you go back to the beginning knowing exactly where Gale ends up? On a reread, that first scene on the hill in District 12 stops being just a cozy hunting trip. You hear Gale joking about running away, then pivoting to we could blow up the capital, and it doesn't feel harmless anymore, does it? At face value, it's teenage rage in a rigged system. But once you've seen the nut, Once you've watched him calmly outline how to trap people underground, that early fantasy suddenly reads as a mission statement. So here's your challenge. Go back to book 1 and track his very first lines about the capital, the games, and the peacekeepers. Every time he says we should have started an uprising years ago, or mocks the idea of playing along, pause and ask, is this just background rebellion? Or is Collins quietly seeding the strategist who one day helped design mass casualty traps? That part matters because it shifts Gale from tragic surprise to tragic inevitability. Then, move into Catching Fire and zoom in on 2 scenes: the whipping and the aftermath. When Gale is flogged in the square, your instinct is pure sympathy. He's the victim of the capital's violence. But watch what happens in your head when you carry that image into the nut planning session in Mockingjay. Does the boy who was tied to the post feel more justified when he says, essentially, seal them in? Or does it make you more uneasy that his pain translates into that specific solution? This is where we talk about District 13. Rewatch the quiet bunker scenes between Gale and Katniss, the rescue mission debates, the conversation about I'm in the enemy's home now. On the surface, it's 2 trauma survivors trying to win a war. Underneath, there is a lot to uncover here about how far each one is willing to go, and how the narrative starts to frame Gale's certainty as dangerous rather than heroic. Now, add a comparison watch. Book Gale versus movie Gale in Mockingjay. The films sharpen his edges. They give him more explicit defenses of the bombing tactics, tighter visual parallels between his designs and Coin's parachutes over the capital children. Ask yourself, when do you feel the story nudging you to see him as complicit? And where do the books leave a little more ambiguity, a little more space for you to decide what you think a victor actually is in a war like this? Try running a personal experiment. Scene by scene, note when you're on Gale's side and when you recoil. When he talks about necessary losses, do you nod because the capital is that bad? Or do you flinch because Prim's face is already in your mind? What does that say about your own ethics around resistance? About where you draw the line between justice and revenge, hope and pure destruction? And then bring it back here. Think of the comments as a mini Victor's village. Same district, different houses. Competing theories about the same boy from the scene. In the next section, we're going to cover how those competing readings explode when you line up specific book passages with the film's visual choices, and what that tension reveals about why adaptation always ends up picking a side. Your verdict: villain, anti-hero, or war's latest victim? So here's the real question. If we're all standing in this courtroom of Panem, what are you actually charging Gale with? Because at face value, the story gives you 3 very different verdicts, and each one changes how you read almost every scene he's in. Option 1. Gale as villain. Not mustache-twirling capital villain, but morally lost, fully complicit in the same logic that built the games. You can point to Mockingjay, to him helping design the double explosion at the nut, and say, that's the moment he crossed the line. The plan targets trapped workers, not just peacekeepers. Then Coin's parachutes fall in the capital. Children die, Prim dies, and Katniss asks him the quiet but devastating question: did your kind of thinking make this possible? Option 2, Gale as anti-hero. He's harsh, but necessary in context. Back in the Hunger Games, when he tells Katniss in the woods that they should blow up the Capitol, it sounds extreme. After Rue's death, after the quarter quell, does it still sound unreasonable? This is where we talk about utilitarian ethics in a district that's been starved for generations. From this angle, his choices are ugly, but he's trying to end the system faster, even if it costs him his soul. Option 3. Gale as war's latest victim, a boy from the seam who never had the luxury of Peeta's ideals or Katniss's symbolic power, the whipping in catching fire, the burden of feeding his siblings, the constant humiliation of the seam. There is a lot to uncover here about how the district grinds him down. By the time he's in Coin's war room, the capital and the rebellion have both trained him to think in casualties, not names. So I want you to pick one: villain, anti-hero, or victim. Drop your verdict and then defend it using at least one specific scene or quote. Does Gale lose you when he says in Mockingjay that we're going to have to kill people to win? Or is his most defensible choice actually volunteering to be whipped instead of letting Darius or Tom take the blame in catching fire? Here are a few prompts to get you going. At what point did Gale lose you, if he ever did? What's the single most defensible thing he does in the entire trilogy? And what's the least? If you were Katniss in that final conversation about the bombs, do you forgive him, or is the relationship permanently over? And remember, disagreement is a feature, not a bug. Collins builds Gale to resist easy categorization. The fact that some readers see a war criminal where others see a traumatized soldier is the whole point. It mirrors how every district would interpret the same broadcast differently. That part matters because it keeps the story from turning into simple Team Peeta versus Team Gale propaganda. Think of this channel as an ongoing courtroom for Panem's most complicated characters, not just a one-off Gale trial. We're going to cover how the text and the films quietly push you towards certain verdicts next. So what happens when the adaptation itself starts stacking the jury against him? Closing the loop, what we learned following Gale's trail we've just laid down for Gale, start to finish. You meet him as the trusted hunting partner, the boy in the woods who shares bread, snares, and secrets. At face value, that first scene in District 12 promises stability. This is the safe relationship, the one that exists before the games, before the capital, before all the televised horror. He's the one who says they could run away. He's the one who hates the system out loud so Katniss doesn't have to. But here's the real question. When you reread that scene knowing where he ends up, does it still feel safe? Or does it feel like the origin story of someone already rehearsing war in his head? From there, we watched him shift. In Catching Fire, Gale stops being just the co-provider and becomes the radical voice in the district. He's the one saying, "We should have started an uprising in the seam, scorning the games as a distraction, pushing Katniss to see that survival without resistance is its own kind of defeat." There is a lot to uncover here, because those lines sound righteous in a world built on cruelty. You want to agree with him. You almost need to. Then Mockingjay takes that anger and weaponizes it. This is where we talk about Gale the strategist, co-designing the double explosion trap at the Nut, standing in war rooms with BT, talking in cool, detached terms about enemy patterns and acceptable losses. The text doesn't scream villain. It just quietly shows you a boy whose moral horizon has been redrawn by years of hunger, whippings, and televised death. By the time Coin uses a near-identical tactic on capital children, the loop closes. Katniss doesn't know if Gale's design was directly used, but she doesn't have to. The resemblance is enough. The boy who once promised to keep Prim safe now represents the logic that killed her. That part matters because it makes him the architect of a mindset, not just a single weapon. So the central conclusion we've been circling is this. Gale is written as Katniss's dark mirror. He walks right up to the edge of villainy, but Collins never stamps evil on his forehead. Instead, she lets war, trauma, and ends justify the means reasoning do the slow, ugly work. He's what happens when a would-be victor of rebellion starts thinking in capital math, acceptable sacrifices, strategic spectacles, without ever realizing how close that relationship is to the enemies. And adaptation and fandom, they either sharpen that edge or sand it off. The films tighten his connection to the bombs, push him into more defensive speeches, and nudge you toward a clearer verdict. A lot of fandom discourse flattens him into either Prim's killer or the boy who was done dirty, depending on which moments you prioritize. Your reading becomes one more move in the games of his afterlife. So when you go back to that first morning in the woods, two teenagers sharing stolen bread and dark jokes about the capital, what are you seeing now? A beginning, a warning, or both? Because if Gale is the warning, the next question is brutal. What does that say about the rebellions we're willing to cheer for? Join the Victor's Village. Next arcs, next questions. Because that's really what we're doing on this channel. We're not just sorting characters into hero, villain, and tragic X. We're treating Panem the way the Capitol treats its victors, under a microscope, replaying every choice, every relationship, every tiny line of dialogue, until the pattern starts to show. There is a lot to uncover here, and Gale is just one square in a much bigger arena. So if you made it all the way to this point, you're basically our version of a career tribute. You're the person who doesn't bail when the morality gets messy, when the story stops being a simple overthrow the bad guy and starts asking what happens the day after. That part matters, because every time you share this, hit the button to stay in the Victor's Village with us, or drop this in a group chat, you're not just boosting numbers. You're telling the algorithm there is still an audience for long-form, morally complicated Hunger Games conversations. And we're going to cover a lot more. If Gale is the warning, what do we do with Coin? On paper, she's the savior president, the answer to Snow. At face value, she offers the district's order, food, and a clean chain of command. But here's the real question. Is she actually a stealth villain whose entire campaign is built on weaponizing trauma? Or was she the inevitable product of a war that people like Gale insisted had to be total? Then there's Snow himself. We all agree he's monstrous, but why did his political strategy work for so long? Why did the games, the victors, the promise of the village keep 12 districts in line for 75 years? This is where we talk about how a man who poisons his rivals can also understand hope, optics, and narrative better than anyone else in Panem. And we haven't even put Katniss and Peeta on the stand yet. A full ethical showdown. The girl on fire whose instinct is to shoot first if it protects her own, versus the baker who keeps insisting that who you are in the games is who you have to live with afterward. Who's actually right about survival? Whose philosophy breaks first under pressure? So tell me in the comments whose arc you want dissected next. Finnick, with his weaponized beauty and secret slavery to the capital. Johanna, who refuses to perform hope for anyone. Haymitch, drunk mentor or long-term strategist, or even the games themselves as a character, evolving from brutal punishment to televised ritual to open rebellion. Because if Gale isn't the villain of the Hunger Games, then who is? Snow, Coin, the system, the audience in the Capitol, or the part of us that nods when Gale says, "Sometimes killing's the only way," and means it? Sit with that. We'll be waiting in the victor's village when you're ready for the next round of games.